Hi, everyone. Welcome to Scoping and Background Research, Part 1 of the Policy Surveillance Program Advanced Webinar Training Series. My name is Joshua Weinberg. I am the Legal Training Manager here at the Center for Public Health Law Research at the Policy Surveillance Program. And so today we are going to get started with the first step in the policy surveillance process, which is scoping and background research. Actually, it's the first two steps, but we'll get to that in more detail in just a little bit. So, for today, our learning objectives today are going to be, one, how to scope a project. So we're going to talk about generally what do we mean by scoping and how does this happen in the policy surveillance context. Additionally, we're going to talk about how to conduct background research. With that, we're also going to talk about the goals of background research and understanding how the goals of background research relate to conducting background research and scoping a project. Really, all of these, while these are two separate steps in terms of the policy surveillance process, they are interrelated steps that will help build the base for the rest of your project. So let's talk about the policy surveillance process. This wheel here represents all of the steps in the policy surveillance process. Generally here at the Policy Surveillance Program and in policy surveillance generally, we tend to work in teams of 3 with 2 researchers and 1 supervisor. This allows many of the steps in the process to be performed redundantly and independently, which then improves the quality of the research and the coding. You'll notice that quality control is in the center of this circle. This is because there are quality control measures that are implemented at every step in the process, and this heightened quality control is what makes the policy surveillance process a scientific approach to collecting law. The transparency and replicability that is provided by a detailed research protocol, also part of our quality control operation, which we'll get to in a few minutes, are key elements of the policy surveillance unique approach to legal mapping. So the other thing you might notice about this is that the policy surveillance process is in a circle and not a straight line. This is because we tend to take an iterative approach to all of these steps, meaning while defining the scope is the first step in the process and tracking and updating the law is the last step, all of the steps are related to each other and they're never finalized. For example, you might, in your actual collection of the law, discover that your scope needs to be expanded, so you go back and redefine the scope. You might have developed your coding questions and realize while you're coding the law that you need to change some of those coding questions, so you go back and do that then. So that's the idea here, is that this is an iterative process that is a circle because it's not a straight line with beginning, middle, and end. It is a circle with a beginning, middle, and end that always relates back to itself. So over the course of this entire series of advanced trainings, we're going to be going through every step in this process. Today, we're going to be talking about the first 2 steps just because they are so interconnected and related to each other. So we might as well start with the first step, defining the scope. So what do we mean by defining the scope? For us, scoping means identifying the topic and parameters of your project. When you embark on a new project, it's likely that you already have an idea of the area of law that you may want to study. Like, for example, in much of today's presentation, we're going to be talking about youth concussion laws. So you might know that you want to study youth concussion laws, but you may not know the particular or specific things within the area of youth concussion laws generally that you want to focus on for a policy surveillance project. Just because oftentimes you come to a project with sort of a broad idea, a broad topic. Scoping here and background research comes in to identify the topic and specific parameters for your project going forward. So for us, scoping includes these essential questions. First, what is the purpose of the project? This is an essential question that you and your team should ask yourselves when you start off any project. What is the purpose of the project? What questions is this project and this data set looking to answer? You want to be able to have specific questions and research questions in mind that you can meet and answer through the course of your project. Who is the audience? Who are we trying to inform here? Is it policymakers? Is it other academics? Is it the general public? The detail and the scope of your project will depend on who your projected audience is. Finally, a very important question for us is whether the data set is going to be cross-sectional or longitudinal. By cross-sectional, we mean a project that's looking across various jurisdictions at a single point in time versus a longitudinal project, which is looking at, again, a large number of jurisdictions, but looking at how those variations amongst jurisdictions change over time as well, not just across place. Oftentimes, we start with a cross-sectional data set and then turn it into a longitudinal data set, but you can also go in straight ahead and start and build a longitudinal data set. For example, as we'll talk about here with youth concussion, initially you might think you want to look at youth concussion laws because there may be a connection between the incidence of youth concussions and the policies surrounding them. However, after you begin to conduct your background research, which we'll discuss in a little bit, you may realize that there are already countless reputable concussion studies that have already been published and data that you already have available. You may then decide to proceed with these projects, or you might want to revisit your scope. That's the idea here. Your background research plays into your scope. So even though the scoping is the first step, your scope is really defined throughout the process of background research. So project planning and management. We just want to talk about this briefly because often it's really important to be organized and to project plan from the get-go. We often use an Excel workbook to plan out our project, divided by sheets, and then we'd have a sheet keeping track of the budget throughout our project. We often start with projected budget, so how much time, how many people are working on the project, costs, and things like that. Another tab would keep track of the specific project deadlines. We often break down our project by these actual steps and set up ideal timelines and deadlines for each step going forward to make sure that we're able to meet the final goal of our project. Additionally, you would want to keep progress by each specific jurisdiction in your project. So not only just generally keeping track of project deadlines across the entire policy surveillance process, but you want to keep track of progress by each jurisdiction and each task for each jurisdiction. And the researchers themselves can update this as they complete each step. And then additionally, if you're doing a data set update or if you are planning on doing one in the future, you can keep track of your update research there as well. And at this step, it's also important to think about who will want to make use of the project, because an important step of the process, and one that shouldn't just be left to the end, is the dissemination of your data. You don't want your data just sitting there in a drawer, no one to ever read it. So the idea here is from the get-go, think about who will use your data, who will use this project, and start thinking about a dissemination plan of how you want to get that out into the world. So now that we've talked about scoping generally, as well as organizing our project plan and management, we're ready to move into the next step in the policy surveillance process, the meatier step, if you will, in these two related first two steps, is the conducting background research. And you'll see as we go through this that the defining the scope step is not done at this point. Although we might have an idea of our general scope because we've answered some of those initial questions, we know who our audience is, we know whether it's cross-sectional, longitudinal, our background research will help us define and redefine the scope, as you'll see in the next few slides. So, this right here are the steps that you would follow when you conduct background research. The following slides will detail these 5 steps in even further detail. First, you want to identify reliable secondary sources. Second, you want to draft a background memorandum to identify key elements of the law and explore the legal landscape on the project's topic. Third, you want to draft a policy memorandum to identify a variation in the law across a sample set of 5 states. Fourth, you want to develop a search strategy. And then finally, you want to compile a sample of laws relevant to your project. It's important to note that background research does not simply seek to collect the laws, but also to identify important policy questions. So, for example, you want to, in our youth sports database, youth sports TBI project that we keep referring back to, it would be important to explore whether return to play after concussion is regulated, and in addition, if return to learn policies are also included. So during this process, we're going to be defining and redefining the scope. As you can see, that arrow goes through all 5 steps of the background research process. So the first step in that process is identifying secondary sources. You want to find reliable secondary sources. These sources, including articles, tables, books, websites, and legal data sets, will allow your team to understand the literature that already exists, the gaps in the research, which is quite important because we want to be able to use our research to fill in those gaps and not just repeat anything that's been done before, and to determine what parts of this topic legislators, researchers, media, academics, students, etc., are focused on and what they're not focused on. It's important, you want your project to be relevant to other people and other work that's been done before, so this will help you put your project in that context and help make sure that your scoping is scoped well enough to fit in to that environment. So secondary sources, because we're going to be talking about youth traumatic brain injury laws as a sample throughout this webinar, we wanted to give you some brief background information on the subject. Currently, all 50 states and Washington, D.C. have adopted laws aimed at reducing the harm caused by youth sports TBI, all since 2008. An estimated 300,000 sports-related traumatic brain injuries occur in the United States each year, and since 2008, states have responded by adopting laws aimed at reducing the harm caused by brain injuries in youth sports. Although men's football has the highest incidence of concussion, as you can see here, and is often the subject that is, and the sport that is most talked about and is the sport that is most regulated by legislators, you can see here by this table that it's not simply just men's football. Ice hockey, lacrosse, soccer, for both men and women, all have high incidence rates of concussion. So these are by the number of concussions per 100,000 exposures. So you can see while football is ahead by a decent amount, ice hockey is not that far behind, and lacrosse and women's soccer and women's lacrosse are not that far behind those as well. So secondary sources, some more on youth sports traumatic brain injury laws. These laws address a variety of issues that we found, including coach and student athlete training, removal from play, parental notification, return to play, return to learn, and preventative measures and liability. States initially addressed this issue by only enacting laws addressing removal from play and return to play and maybe some training for coaches, etc. However, states soon began to adopt laws surrounding return to learn and have also created measures aimed at preventing concussions in the first place, such as with limiting play time and restricting tackling during practice. So this is an example of how a longitudinal project could capture this in a different way than a cross-sectional project. Longitudinal project can show that over time since these laws first started in 2008, the actual details and elements of the law have grown and adapted. And for example, the return to learn stuff is a more recent inclusion as opposed to return to play issues which have been there from the beginning. So let's get into what we talk about when we talk about doing background research. So once you've identified secondary sources, you are ready to write a background memo, or what we refer to as a background memo. A background memo is a memorandum that summarizes and synthesizes the information that you have uncovered about the topic's legal landscape. In our shop, we generally do this and assign 2 researchers to write a background memo on the same issue. By doing so, we increase the likelihood that important details and trends will not be missed by a single researcher. This, again, is what we talk about when we talk about quality control being a part of every step of our process. The trends and details that are identified in these background memorandum are helpful in continuing to define and redefine the scope of our project. These background memos are going to discuss the legal landscape, so we want to talk about beyond just the state of the law, but how the law exists nationally. For example, if this project is looking at every state in the United States, it's going to look at how the legal landscape looks across the country, the sources of law and how they interact, whether do states use statutes, regulations, school policies, etc. How is this actually regulated? And then this background memo will also allow you to identify key elements of the laws that you are studying. So, again, the goals of a background memo. The background memorandum is a key for acquainting researchers with a topic. This may be a novel topic for one or all of your researchers, or the law may be more complex than initially anticipated. So the idea here is that the team will become familiar with the topic from the beginning. Another goal is to find gaps in already existing research. The research will allow you to further explore the legal landscape and how they interact with each other. For example, you will find out, is preemption an issue? Is it regulated at the local, state, or federal level? You'll be able to discover unforeseen challenges, identify key elements of the laws you're studying, identify what areas of the law are evolving, as well as what elements of the law are present in most jurisdictions, and identify these key trends in the law and how they've changed over time. And so, for example, in this case, in the case of youth traumatic brain injury, we'll find out at the end of this process that youth TBI is regulated at the state level and that preemption is not an issue with this project. So from there, we're ready to move on to, once we've written these background memos, we've read them, reviewed them, discussed them amongst the researchers, we're ready to move to the next step, writing another memo. So after you finish with your background memorandum, the two researchers who have written the background memorandums will then write a policy memorandum, which is a document that summarizes laws in 5 sample jurisdictions that are relevant to the project's topic. So in this situation where we have 2 researchers each writing their own policy memorandum, they would each have a sample of 5 jurisdictions with a 10 jurisdictions total sample. These 10 jurisdictions can either be selected randomly or they can be done strategically based on the outcome of your background research. If you discover that there are certain jurisdictions that are ahead of the curve on a topic or certain jurisdictions that are behind, you can focus on those jurisdictions and sort of get a full detailed analysis of the state of those law by strategically picking your states for your policy memorandums. This sample size of 10 states that we use at this step is also important because they will be the first 10 states that we code when we get to that step later on. And because we do our process in batches in 10 jurisdictions at a time, those 10 jurisdictions that will be written about in your policy memorandum will then eventually turn into the 10 jurisdictions for batch 1 of your project. We do this, we're going to discuss this later when we get to collecting and coding the law in some later webinars. I think that's parts 3 and 4, if I'm correct. But what the whole idea here is that doing it in these batches will decrease the number of divergences as each batch is finished. So for example, if we finish these first 10 batches and we realize we've missed some responses or we need to expand or change the scope, then we don't have to go back and do that for all 51 jurisdictions at the same time. And instead, we do that for 10 jurisdictions at a time, builds on those 10 jurisdictions. So when we get to batch 2, it's then 20 jurisdictions, and we're able to reduce the number of divergences as each batch is added to the project. Another important note here, just an aside, is that throughout this example and throughout a lot of our discussion of policy surveillance, we are using state statutes as an example, but you have to remember that legal mapping can be done at any level. That can be at the local level. You can talk about jurisdictions as like different counties within a state, different townships and cities within a county. You can work on the global, international level, comparing countries, and you can even work on a policy level, so not on a specific statute or regulatory level. So if you wanted to compare, school board policies of districts in a certain county or state, or hospital policies, all policies of a certain hospitals in a certain county, you could also do that here as well. So that's why we refer to it as a 5 jurisdiction policy memo, and because even though we're generally talking about states, it can really be any jurisdiction that is relevant to your topic. So, real quick, the goals of a policy memorandum. We want to identify the source and structure of the law. So, for example, with youth traumatic brain injury, we would discover in the course of writing the policy memorandum that laws are regulated at the state statutory level, at the state regulatory level, in local ordinances, in formal policies at schools, and at historical statutes and regulations. We want to present a sample of laws relevant to our topic. So after identifying the sources of laws that can be collected for each jurisdiction, the policy memorandum is then able to present a sample of relevant laws for each of the 5 jurisdictions analyzed within. And then most importantly, perhaps, the policy memorandum will allow us to compare the samples of relevant laws in each of these 5 jurisdictions to identify variations of the law. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do in policy surveillance is identify these variations across jurisdictions and across time so that we can have interesting legal mapping data. At the end of your policy memorandum, you should be able to compare what the law says in each jurisdiction about important elements of the law and what you've identified in your background memo. These identified variations in the law will directly lead into developing your constructs and your questions, which we will discuss in later time. So, for right now, we are going to review the sample policy memo. We're going to take about 10 minutes now we have a sample policy memo with similarities and differences in 2 jurisdictions. We have basically, instead of a 5 jurisdiction policy memo, because that might be a little too much for this webinar, we've created a 2 policy memo for you, 2 jurisdiction policy memo. So you want to identify and record key similarities and differences in the laws so that we can compare them. And then when we get back together in about 10 minutes, we'll discuss our findings. So if you have any questions or if you're having trouble getting the documents, they should be available for you on the site page for this webinar. But we'll return in 10 minutes to discuss our similarities and differences in the laws in the sample policy memorandum. Thank you. All right, great. So it's been about 10 minutes. Let's talk about some of the similarities and differences that we found. From similarities, both Colorado and Virginia both require removal from play whenever a coach suspects that the student athlete has sustained a concussion. Additionally, both states require student athletes be provided by written clearance by a health care professional provider before they can return to play. Those were the main similarities we found. Differences include that Colorado's law only applies to participants aged 11 and 19, excluding college and university in their definition of youth athletic activity, while Virginia does not mention age in their definition. Colorado requires coaches to complete an annual concussion recognition course, while Virginia requires that guidelines be distributed to coaches, student athletes, and parents. Colorado indicates that an athletic trainer can manage a student athlete's graduated return to play. Virginia requires that student athletes and parents review concussion guidelines released by the local school district annually and requires that they each sign a statement about that information. Virginia includes a return to learn protocol for managing a student athlete's gradual return to the classroom, while Colorado does not. Virginia regulates non-interscholastic youth sports programs. And Virginia requires local school districts to develop their own guidelines, while Colorado has the requirements for school districts directly stated in the law. So we would write in conclusion that that there are a good amount of key differences and similarities between the jurisdictions. And so, for example, the conclusion might note that specifically that the law structures are different, that in Colorado, the requirements are stated directly in the law, whereas Virginia local school districts are required to develop their own guidelines. So, continuing on in our presentation, next we move on to the idea of defining and redefining the scope of the project. So, the initial scope of the project sets the parameters for what you will study. However, the scope of the project may change and should change, honestly, throughout the policy surveillance process. And this is one key aspect of background research, is identifying the important research questions for your topic. And it's important to remember, I think I've mentioned it a number of times already, but here we're going to mention it again, drive it home, that scoping is iterative and that repeats and refines itself. So we might, at this point, we might have collected the sample of laws and realized that we have not included in our scope an entire area, including like how the law is structured. So we might not have included, we might have noticed from our background research that the structure of the law and who must determine the regulations, the school district or the state legislator, was not included in our original scope. And now we can go back and expand or contract that through this process. So let's talk about developing a search strategy. So after identifying the sources of law in our 5-policy memorandum, it's time to develop a search strategy for our project. This will facilitate the collection of relevant laws and allow us to create master sheets for each jurisdiction in our project. A search strategy consists of the search terms, databases used, and strategies to be employed by the researchers working on the policy surveillance project. As we draft our background and policy memos, we should refine our search strategy and record it. We go into each step in more detail in the following slides, but the 3 steps in developing a search strategy include multiple search strategies using to ensure accurate research, measures that should be adopted to minimize error in our search strategy, and then recording strategies on the daily research sheet. So let's go through those. Search strategy, using different search strategies. What we mean by this is acknowledging the fact that by using different search strategies, we adopt measures to minimize errors in our overall search strategy. Some jurisdictions may structure their law differently from others, necessitating different search strategies. So for in this example, as we see here, Oregon has all of their relevant laws in one section. However, California has their relevant laws in 3 different sections for the same area that Oregon has in one law. So we want to identify how these jurisdictions structure their laws differently, and so that we're collecting all of the relevant laws throughout our search strategy. Developing a search strategy. We want to use multiple search strategies to ensure reliable and accurate legal research. That includes identifying keywords by identifying common terms of art relevant to the project's topic. So for example, in a youth sports traumatic brain injury project, we're going to want to search for laws that mention youth concussions. However, not all laws are going to refer to the TBI as concussions within the text of their law. So we want to be able to search for traumatic brain injury, concussion, head injury, so that we don't miss out on relevant laws if we just search for concussions. We also want to explore whether it is a viable option to use a table of contents to search for the law we're interested in. This is actually a very useful idea. So, for example, when you, if we're looking at youth TBI and we find that most of the relevant law is in the education title, we can then look at the table of contents or the chapter index for the education section of the law to see if there are any relevant laws within that table of contents. Recording the search strategy. As part of our efforts to make our policy surveillance process replicable and transparent, we will want to record all search terms and strategies in our research protocol document, including the databases used to perform the research, the search terms and connectors used, the results yielded from searches, and the notes on the search strategy that we use. Researchers should keep track of the search terms that were used to collect the law for each jurisdiction throughout the process. And they should also include information of how many results each search yielded, what laws were collected by each search, and general notes on what is and is not working in the search strategy. It's useful for an individual researcher to keep their own research sheet with these notes over the course of the research phase in order to keep track of their change of strategy. The search strategy, as we said up in this slide, should be included in the research protocol, which is a living document describing the methodology used in a project that evolves throughout the course of the project. The goal of the protocol is to create a transparent and replicable project and to help any researchers further along. So when we are going through the rest of our batches, or maybe when we go back for an update, we have our search strategy and what terms worked and what didn't recorded here so that we have an easier time of going about all of that. As researchers are collecting the law, they should record their search terms as well as what databases they were used to conduct the research. They should describe their search strategy for each state, for instance, and whether they just use the search terms or explore the table of contents in a state law to find their results. This again ensures that it is replicable and transparent. So here we generally want to invite you to send us some example search terms that you would use, search strings that you would use in your research based on the Colorado and Virginia memos that we provided earlier. So you've written those memos. Now we want to imagine you're researching what laws exist in those two states based on the legal landscape presented to you in the policy memorandum. So if you could, send us in the chat example search strings that you could possibly use, and then we'll give you about 5 minutes to send those, and then we'll go over some of the results that you sent to us. Welcome back. A number of you sent some interesting search string options for us. So yeah, generally you're going to want to use the language that you picked up in the course of your writing your background memorandums and policy memorandums. So for example, you want to search traumatic brain injuries in quotes, maybe plus with and youth. You want to also search for concussion, maybe specifically return to play or return to learn. Sometimes those language will be used specifically. Amongst other search terms that you've suggested to us. Generally, you're going to find that you're going to need to get the full scope of return that you want, you're going to need to use a number of different terms and strings. These other questions should also be discussed with your team as you go through this process. What secondary sources would you use? It's actually really helpful if there are existing secondary sources out there to compare some of your research to. That adds another element of quality control beyond having multiple researchers. And additionally, what search engines are right for your project? Are you looking for laws and policies, regulations? So are you using legal databases? Are you using local law? Are you looking at a website like municipal code websites? Are you looking at state legislature websites? What search engines are right for your project? These are all good questions to ask as you figure out your search strategy. So, publication documents. We talked about this a little earlier, but this is really important. The research protocol. The research protocol outlines the entire methodology and process of the project. So policy surveillance aims to measure features of the law in a transparent, replicable manner. The research protocol is an essential document to meeting that goal because it provides the front-end user with a description of how the project has been created and allows other researchers to replicate the data by describing the methodology. A research protocol makes it easier to maintain and update the project as laws change. So if you are updating this as you go forward in time, this is an essential document to allow any future researchers to understand how you had done this project originally. And then it supports this by detailing specific methodologies, search strategies, search terms, data collection method, coding methods, coding rules. This is a document that is going to be referenced throughout the entirety of our webinar series because of its importance. But to start with, the research protocol includes the scope of the project, including the dates of the project, the team involved, jurisdictions at issue, the purpose of the project, and variables. And additionally, as we've talked about here in terms of background research, we also want to include data collection methods, including search strategy and databases used. Additionally, the research protocol will also include coding methods, including coding schemes and definitions of terms of art, and descriptions of quality control measures. We're going to get into these in later ones, and you'll see what we mean exactly by all this, but basically, you'll note that every step that we take in the policy surveillance process is recorded in some way on the research protocol. So, in summary, scoping consists of identifying the topic and parameters for your project. The steps and scoping is a step that is never truly finished. It's why it's the first step, but it's also kind of the last step. We're constantly redefining, rescoping based on every other step in the policy surveillance process, including background research. So real quick, we're going to go over the 5 steps of the background research in summary. We identify our secondary sources. We want to make sure that there are secondary sources out there, that we're not repeating this research that's been done by any existing secondary sources. We want to draft a background memorandum. Generally, we have 2 researchers each independently draft a background memorandum that will identify the background memorandum, which will identify the general scope of the area, the legal landscape, the history of that legal area, and maybe the social significance, the public health significance. We generally work in public health here, but it's important to remember that the policy surveillance process can be used for any area of law across any type of jurisdiction. So it doesn't have to be public health. You can look at state constitutions for some sort of constitutional law issue and compare constitutions across jurisdiction or anything else like that. Similarly, the next step after drafting a background memorandum and having an idea of sort of the legal landscape of the area is you want to draft a 5-state memorandum or a policy memorandum. It doesn't have to be state, as I just mentioned. But what this accomplishes, we again have 2 researchers generally each write their own 5-jurisdiction memorandum on 5 different jurisdictions. What this will allow us to do is really get into the nitty-gritty of variations amongst the key elements of the law. This is basically the first step in figuring out our coding questions and figuring out our scheme, our constructs that will then allow us to write coding questions that will then allow us to answer those questions and create usable legal data that identifies variations and differences across jurisdictions and potentially over time. So these first 10 jurisdictions in these policy memos will also become the first 10 jurisdictions for our collection and coding. So it's important to either decide them randomly, those jurisdictions, or you can have choose jurisdictions based on your background memorandum that really represent what you're understanding at this time of the variations in the law across jurisdiction. We then want to develop and record a search strategy, meaning, as we discussed, how you found the specific laws, what language we use, what databases we use, what search engines we use, and then finally compile a sample of laws. This is done as part of the policy memo. But basically, by compiling the sample of laws and legal text, we'll have a much better idea of what the law says and how it is structured going forward. So, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to ask us any questions in the chat box here. Additionally, please keep in touch with us. We are here to help. The Policy Surveillance Program, we pride ourselves in being a resource for all things policy surveillance. So email us, visit our website, tweet at us, etc. Our website is a repository of all things policy surveillance. It includes all of our published data sets. So if you go to lawatlas.org, you're able to see all of the projects that we've worked on, our team has worked on in the past, and included in that we have our research protocol, so you can see what a final research protocol is like. Additionally, you can look at the final data, the code books, everything else that we publish along with it, everything all the next webinars in this series will talk about basically how we get to that point of publication. Additionally, I want to encourage anyone out there who is interested in doing their own policy surveillance project to reach out to us. We are, again, here to help. We often do technical assistance, so if you have specific questions for your project and want some help or review, we also work with researchers on going after grants together. So if you have something like that you're interested in doing, please just reach out to us. We are here to help, and we are here to be your policy surveillance experts. So with that, that is the end of our first webinar in the advanced series. Hopefully you can join us next time for the second step in the process, which will be question development. So if no one has any questions at this time, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Again, my name is Joshua Weinberg. I am the Legal Training Manager here at the Center for Public Health Law Research, and I am here to answer any of your questions that you may have. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.